So I want you to imagine that you are a highly decorated airline captain.
Right.
You've got thousands of hours of flight time under your belt. You've crossed oceans, you've navigated through these massive thunderstorms, and you've successfully managed like countless mechanical hiccups over your career.
You're at the absolute top of your game.
Exactly, the pinnacle of your profession.
Hmm.
But today, as you're approaching your destination, a $2 light bulb on your dashboard suddenly burns out.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's just the indicator light that tells you your landing gear is down. I mean, it's a trivial mechanical nuisance,
That
but
burned out bulb.
right. Yet because of the hidden, deeply toxic psychological dynamics inside your cockpit, because your junior officers are utterly terrified to, speak up and question your authority, that dead light bulb is going to result in the destruction of your aircraft.
Wow.
And the loss of life. I mean, the plane is perfectly fine, the engines are flawless, the weather is clear, but your crew's inability to communicate is about to fly a fully functioning machine straight into the ground.
It's a chilling scenario, for sure. And honestly, the most unsettling part is that for decades, that was the reality of commercial aviation.
Yeah.
The industry just possessed this profound blind spot. I mean, they had spent billions of dollars engineering the aerodynamics, refining the jet engines, building all these structural redundancies into the airframes.
Right, the hardware.
Exactly, the hardware. The overarching assumption was always that if a plane crashed, well, a physical component must have fractured. They treated aviation safety as an exclusively engineering problem.
Right. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are exploring this towering stack of research, historical case studies, and regulatory notes, all titled The Evolution and Architecture of Crew Resource Management.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And our mission today is to uncover how the global aviation industry finally realized that their perfectly engineered machines were being destroyed by, well, flawed human psychology.
Yeah.
And how they fundamentally rewired human behavior to stop airplanes from just falling out of the sky.
The paradigm shift we are examining today is really the birth of crew resource management, which is universally known in the industry as CRM.
CRM, right.
And to understand the gravity of this, we really have to look back to a specific inflection point, which was a 1979 NASA workshop on flight deck design and operation.
1979.
Yeah. Researchers presented data there that completely shattered the industry's worldview. I mean, the data proved that the overwhelming majority of aviation accidents were not caused by mechanical failure.
The planes were fine.
The planes were totally fine. The primary cause of these catastrophic accidents was human error, specifically, failed communication, catastrophic breakdowns in decision-making, and really toxic leadership.
Wow.
So CRM was born not as a mechanical valve to be installed in an engine, but as a framework for the effective utilization of all available resources.
Right.
That means human, hardware, and information resources, all working together to achieve safe flight.
And this is exactly why you, listening to this right now, need to care about this deep dive. Because we are going to frame the next hour not just as some dry aviation history lesson, but as an absolute masterclass in psychology, communication, and extreme teamwork.
Absolutely.
Because the exact same behavioral frameworks that keep a 300-ton metal tube safely in the air, they are profoundly applicable to your own life.
Well, 100%.
Whether you are managing a corporate marketing team or running a trauma ward in a hospital, or, honestly, just trying to navigate complex, high-stress family dynamics, the architecture of crew resource management is a blueprint for optimizing human performance under pressure.
It really is. The ultimate goal here is building resilience. Yeah. But that resilience, it didn't just happen overnight. The modern, highly synchronized cockpit is the result of over 40 years of behavioral evolution.
Yeah, it was a process.
A long process. The industry actually categorizes this evolution into 6 distinct generations. And to appreciate the modern cognitive toolkit they use today, we have to understand the deeply flawed human operating system they started with.
Yeah, let's wind the clock back to the late 1970s and early 1980s, because when you read the source material about the culture of flight decks in that era, it genuinely sounds like a different universe.
It really does.
We're talking about the era of the authoritarian captain. Many of these men were veterans who had flown bombers in World War II or fighters in Korea and Vietnam.
They're literal combat veterans.
Exactly. And they were treated with almost godlike reverence by their airlines. Their word was absolute law.
Yeah, the culture was entirely defined by machismo and this incredibly rigid hierarchy. The captain was the supreme commander, right? And the first officer, the co-pilot, was essentially expected to Well, sit on their hands, raise the landing gear when ordered, and speak only when spoken to.
Just push the buttons I tell you to push.
Exactly. Questioning the captain's judgment wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a severe breach of professional protocol. So the initial attempts to fix this, what we call the first generation of CRM, focus almost exclusively on individual psychology.
Which is wild to think about. I am trying to picture a room full of these hard-nosed veteran combat pilots being forced to sit in a circle while a behavioral psychologist tells them they need to, like, share their feelings and soften their tone.
Oh, yeah.
I can't imagine that went over well. They must have viewed it as complete corporate psychobabble.
The resistance was monumental. I mean, the early seminars were jokingly referred to by the pilots as charm schools.
Charm schools, that's hilarious.
Right. The curriculum was really heavy on individual psychological profiling. They were using tools like the managerial grid to label captains as dictatorial or first officers as submissive. But the fundamental flaw of this first generation was its abstraction. Psychologists were telling pilots to be nicer and more communicative, but they weren't giving them concrete methods to integrate those soft skills into the actual physical task of flying a jet through a thunderstorm.
Right.
Telling an authoritarian leader to be a better listener doesn't provide a functional checklist for managing a dual engine failure.
It's like telling a struggling basketball team to just want it more.
Exactly.
It doesn't give them a play to run. So they realized targeting individual personality types was a dead end. How did the training evolve to actually impact the workflow in the cockpit?
Well, the breakthrough came when the focus shifted from the individual to the team. During the second and third generations, the industry basically stopped trying to change personalities and started engineering team dynamics.
Okay, so less charm school, more strategy.
Yeah. The training began to emphasize shared situational awareness, specific briefing strategies, and structured stress management. They stopped looking at the captain and the first officer as two isolated brains competing for authority.
Right. And they started training them to function as a single cognitive unit.
And what's crucial here, according to the notes, is that they realized this cognitive unit couldn't just be locked behind a reinforced door.
Absolutely not.
If you only train the two people sitting in the front seats to talk to each other, you are still operating with a massive blind spot. Our sources highlight that the third generation of CRM fundamentally broadened the scope of who is considered part of the team.
Because a commercial airliner is a massive socio-technical system. The pilots cannot operate safely in a vacuum. Generation 3 is where the cockpit and cockpit resource management was officially changed to crew.
Crew resource management.
Right. The safety boundary was expanded to include flight attendants, maintenance technicians, and ground dispatchers.
Because think about the perspective difference there. The pilots have a wall of instruments, sure, but they are strapped into their seats looking forward.
A flight attendant in the back of the plane can physically look out a window and see ice accumulating on the wing. A mechanic on the tarmac can see hydraulic fluid leaking from a landing gear strut.
Right.
If the corporate hierarchy is so rigid that a flight attendant is terrified to pick up the interphone and interrupt the captain to report that ice, well, all the instruments in the world won't save that plane. The hierarchy had to be flattened across the entire company.
That flattening of the hierarchy required a shared mental model. Everyone, from the baggage handler all the way up to the senior captain, had to understand that they were sensory nodes in the same safety network.
Sensory nodes, I like that.
But even with that realization, there was a lingering structural problem in how airlines were teaching this. Throughout these early generations, CRM was treated as a separate academic subject.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. A pilot would go to a classroom on a Tuesday to learn about communication and teamwork, and then on Thursday, they would go to the flight simulator to practice physical maneuvers like engine-out landings.
So they were treating the psychology and the mechanics as two completely isolated disciplines.
Exactly.
You learn to talk nicely in the classroom and you learn to fly the plane in the simulator. How do you bridge that gap? I mean, how do you force a pilot to use their communication skills when their hands are full and the alarms are blaring?
Well, the solution was the fourth generation of CRM, which is defined by proceduralization. The aviation industry integrated the psychological concepts directly into the standard operating procedures.
Okay.
They introduced frameworks like the Advanced Qualification Program, or AQP. So CRM was no longer an abstract philosophy. It became a mandatory graded procedure baked directly into the flight checklists.
That is a brilliant way to bypass the machismo resistance. You weaponize the psychology by making it a technical requirement.
Yes,
If
exactly.
a pilot is in the simulator and perfectly executes the physical maneuvers to land a broken plane, but they fail to brief the first officer, or they don't solicit input from the rest of the crew, they fail the check ride.
They fail. Period.
Being a highly communicative teammate became just as legally necessary for keeping your pilot's license as knowing how to lower the flaps.
By tying career progression directly to psychological performance,
Sorry.
the industry basically forced a culture change. But as we move into the fifth generation, we encounter what is arguably the most profound philosophical leap in the history of safety science.
Okay, lay it on me.
It is a concept called threat and error management, or TEM. And to understand why TEM is so revolutionary, we have to look at the underlying assumption of all the training that came before it. Prior to the fifth generation, the unspoken dogma was error elimination.
Meaning?
The belief was that a highly trained professional pilot should simply not make mistakes.
They demanded absolute perfection, which, as anyone who has ever occupied a human body knows, is completely impossible. The human brain is messy, it gets tired, it gets distracted, it misreads numbers.
Exactly. And the fifth generation represented the moment the global aviation industry officially surrendered to human fallibility. They just accepted that human error is completely inevitable. It does not matter if a captain has 30 years of experience. Under the right mix of fatigue and complexity, they will push the wrong button. And once an organization accepts that error is inevitable, punishing the error becomes counterproductive.
That makes total sense.
Instead, the entire training architecture shifts toward proactive management.
So instead of trying to build a perfect human, you build a system that acts like a safety net for an imperfect human. The sources mention the mantra for threat and error management is avoid, trap, and mitigate.
That's it. The training focuses on anticipating mistakes before they happen. You try to avoid the error entirely through good briefings.
Okay.
But when the inevitable error does occur, your cross-checking procedures are designed to trap that error before it affects the flight path. And if the error slips through the trap, you rely on your training to mitigate the consequences so it doesn't spiral into a disaster.
It removes the shame from making a mistake and replaces it with a professional obligation to catch mistakes. It takes the ego completely out of the equation. And that perfectly sets up the current frontier of aviation safety, the sixth generation, which is focused on resilience and a concept called Safety 2. Let's unpack Safety 2, because the terminology in the notes gets a bit dense here. If there is a Safety 2, what was Safety 1?
Good question. Safety is the traditional approach to risk management. It is inherently reactive. In a safety eye framework, you wait for an accident to happen, you investigate what went wrong, and then you write a new rule to ensure the specific failure never happens again.
You're constantly fighting the last war.
Exactly. Safety 2 flips the lens entirely. Instead of obsessing over the rare instances where things go wrong, Safety 2 investigates why things go right most of the time.
Oh, interesting.
Because every single day, tens of thousands of commercial flights land safely despite terrible weather, fatigued crews, and minor mechanical failures. Safety 2 seeks to understand and amplify the adaptive capacity that allows human crews to navigate those messy, variable conditions successfully.
I think of this as a kind of cognitive martial art. It's the realization that the universe is just endlessly creative in how it can ruin your day.
Right.
You cannot possibly write a step-by-step checklist for every bizarre anomaly. You can't write a manual for a flock of Canadian geese flying into both engines at 3,000 feet over New York City.
No, you really can't.
If you rely entirely on rigid checklists, a highly novel event will cause your brain to just freeze. So resilience engineering is about training the brain how to fall and recover gracefully. It's building cognitive bandwidth so that when the unprecedented happens, the crew can creatively use whatever resources are left to invent a solution on the fly.
Building that psychological shock absorber is the ultimate goal. We have traced an incredible arc here, from yelling at pilots to be nicer, all the way to engineering mental resilience for unprecedented crises.
Right.
But the obvious question is how this actually translates from theory to daily practice.
Right.
I mean, an airline cannot simply hand a pilot a book on resilience and hope for the best.
Yeah, theory is just theory unless it is enforced. And this isn't some weekend corporate retreat with trust falls. The notes outline how airlines enforce these 6 generations of behavioral science, and it is a massive, lifelong, legally mandated curriculum. We're talking about the law of the sky.
The regulatory framework is ironclad. Modern aviation authorities leave no room for interpretation regarding human factors. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, enforces this through regulation AMC1ORO.FC.115.
Very catchy name.
Right. And in the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration mandates it under Advisory Circular 12051E. These documents make crew resource management strictly mandatory for all commercial flight crews.
Mandatory.
If an airline cannot definitively prove to the regulators that they are continuously training their employees' psychology, their operating certificate will simply be revoked.
Let's walk through what the sources call the career life cycle of CRM, because this behavioral conditioning starts long before a pilot is ever allowed to take responsibility for hundreds of passengers.
The conditioning begins with the initial operator's training. Before a newly hired pilot is permitted to begin unsupervised line flying, they must complete an extensive groundwork phase.
Okay.
And this isn't about how to fly the plane they already know how to fly. This is about indoctrination into the specific safety culture of that airline. They learn the foundational human factors, the standard operating procedures, and the communication protocols that that specific company demands.
So they get their baseline, but the aviation industry is dynamic. Pilots move up the ranks, and they transition to different aircraft. Let's say I am a pilot, and I have spent the last 5 years flying a Boeing 737.
Well,
It's second nature to me. Then my airline decides to transition me to an Airbus A320. Now, an airplane is an airplane, right? They both have wings, engines, and a tail. Do I really need to learn a completely different CRM mindset just because the logo on the steering wheel changed?
the physical principles of lift and drag are the same, sure, but the psychological interface with the machine is radically different. When you switch aircraft types, you undergo an operator conversion course.
Okay.
During this course, CRM elements are deeply integrated because different aircraft manufacturers employ fundamentally different philosophies regarding automation and human authority. The difference between Boeing and Airbus is actually the perfect example of this.
Break that down for us. How does the engineering philosophy of Boeing differ psychologically from Airbus?
Historically, Boeing's design philosophy has centered on keeping the human pilot intimately in the loop, providing tactile physical feedback. In a traditional Boeing flight deck, the two control yokes, the steering wheels, are mechanically linked.
Right.
So if the first officer pulls their yoke back to climb, the captain's yoke physically moves in tandem between their knees. You can literally feel what the other pilot or the autopilot is doing. Furthermore, the underlying philosophy is that the human always has the final say. If the pilot applies enough physical force, they can override the computer's recommendations.
The human is the ultimate authority. The computer is just an advisor. What about Airbus?
Airbus pioneered the modern fly-by-wire system with a very different philosophy. They implemented hard limits, which are known as flight envelope protections.
Okay, protections.
Yeah, Airbus computers calculate the absolute safe boundaries of the aircraft's aerodynamics. So if a pilot pulls back on the side stick and demands a climb so steep that the wings would stall and lose lift, the Airbus computer will simply intervene.
Wow.
It will refuse the pilot's input and lower the nose to prevent the stall, regardless of how hard the pilot pulls. Additionally, the side sticks in an Airbus are independent. They are not physically linked. If the first officer makes an input, the captain's stick does not move.
That is a staggering psychological shift. Transitioning from a Boeing to an Airbus isn't just learning where the new light switches are.
No, not at all.
You have to completely recalibrate your relationship with trust and control. You have to accept that the computer actually has veto power over your physical inputs. And because the control sticks aren't linked, you have to develop entirely new communication habits to verbally verify what the other pilot is doing because you can no longer feel it.
Exactly. The CRM required to manage a highly automated Airbus is entirely different from the CRM required for a legacy Boeing. The conversion course forces the pilot to rebuild their mental model of who is actually flying the airplane.
Wow.
And once that mental model is established, the pilot enters the continuous cycle of annual recurrent training.
And this recurrent training isn't just a stagnant review of old textbooks, is it? Our notes mention that this is heavily driven by data.
It is a highly dynamic living curriculum. Airlines operate a safety management system, or SMS. This system constantly ingests millions of data points from flight data recorders and voluntary de-identified pilot reports.
Okay, so real-time data.
Yeah. If the safety department notices a statistical trend, say, perhaps crews in their fleet are increasingly experiencing communication breakdowns during taxiing at complex airports, or there is a spike in altitude deviations during descent, that specific behavioral flaw immediately becomes the focus of the recurrent CRM training for the entire airline over a 3-year rolling cycle.
The curriculum adapts in real time to the actual mistakes the human workforce is making. That is incredible. But the biggest psychological shift in a pilot's career has to be the promotion to the left seat.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's say I've been a first officer for a decade, executing the captain's orders. Finally, I get the tap on the shoulder to upgrade to captain. How does the training change to prepare me for that burden?
The transition occurs during the command upgrade course, and the focus shifts dramatically. As a first officer, your primary responsibility was managing the aircraft's trajectory and supporting the commander. When you move to the left seat, you assume ultimate legal and moral responsibility for the lives of everyone on board. The training pivots heavily toward the human factors of leadership, workload delegation, and conflict resolution. You are no longer just a pilot. You are a manager of a complex, high-stakes micro-organization.
And managing that organization means managing people outside of your immediate line of sight. Which brings us back to that concept of breaking down silos. The regulations mandate something called combined training?
Yes. Airlines are required to conduct joint training sessions that physically place flight crews, cabin crews, and often technical and dispatch personnel into the exact same room, working through simulated emergencies together.
Put yourself in the listener's shoes for a second. In a standard corporate environment, the marketing department rarely trains with the IT department.
Right.
They exist in different silos. Why is it so critical in aviation to shatter these professional boundaries?
Because in a crisis at 30,000 feet, physical and professional silos are fatal. Consider a severe engine fire scenario. The pilots in the cockpit are looking at digital displays and warning lights indicating a fire in the left engine.
Okay.
But from their seats, they cannot physically see the wings. Meanwhile, a flight attendant in the cabin can look out the window and clearly see flames trailing behind the aircraft. They might also hear unusual vibrations or smell smoke long before the cockpit sensors detect it.
Two completely different sets of sensory data for the same emergency?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the pilots and the flight attendants have never trained together, if they don't share a common vocabulary, the response is going to be fractured. The flight attendant might hesitate to call the flight deck, assuming the pilots are too busy or already know.
Yeah, I don't want to bother them.
Right. Or, if they do call, the captain might dismiss the flight attendant's visual report because it contradicts a faulty cockpit gauge. Combined training ensures that the captain respects the flight attendant as a vital intelligence-gathering asset, and it empowers the flight attendant to assertively interrupt the pilots when they see a threat.
Makes sense.
They practice speaking the same language so that when the adrenaline hits, there is no ambiguity.
You are pre-building trust so that when the alarms go off, the communication pathways are already lubricated.
Exactly.
So we've established the legal framework and the career timeline. But let's dive into the actual cognitive toolkit. What are the specific behavioral mechanics these crews are practicing in these simulators? Let's go deeper into threat and error management, because this seems to be the engine that drives modern CRM.
TEM is a highly structured framework for perceiving reality. It breaks the operational environment down into 3 distinct phases. The first phase involves identifying threats. In the TEM vocabulary, a threat is a complexity that exists outside the crew's control. It is a condition that increases the difficulty of the flight.
Let me try to translate this to a non-aviation scenario to make sure I grasp it.
Go for it.
If I am driving my car to work in the winter, a threat would be a sudden blizzard or a section of black ice on the highway, or even the fact that I didn't get enough sleep the night before.
Right.
I didn't create the snowstorm, but it drastically increases the complexity of my commute.
That is a perfect translation.
Yeah.
In aviation, threats include severe convective weather, complex air traffic control reroutes, a high-altitude airport surrounded by terrain, or even an aircraft departing with a known deferred maintenance issue like a broken auxiliary power unit.
Ah, okay.
The CRM protocol dictates that crews must actively verbalize these threats during their pre-flight briefings, because you simply cannot manage a threat you haven't acknowledged.
So you map out the minefield first. What is the second phase?
The second phase is managing errors. Errors are the human actions or inactions that lead to deviations from the intended plan. It is the crew actively making a mistake.
Like what?
This could be misinterpreting a clearance from air traffic control, entering the wrong waypoint into the flight management computer, or simply forgetting to turn on the anti-ice systems when entering freezing rain.
Okay, going back to the car analogy, the threat was the black ice. The error is me tapping the brakes too hard when I hit the ice, causing the car to lose traction.
Precisely. And because TEM accepts that humans will inevitably tap the brakes too hard, The critical skill is trapping that error before it evolves into the third and most dangerous phase, the undesired aircraft state, or UAS.
Undesired aircraft state. That sounds like a very polite, bureaucratic way of saying the plane is falling out of the sky.
It's definitely the polite term. It generally means the aircraft is in a position, speed, or configuration that compromises safety. To complete your car analogy, the undesired aircraft state is when your car is actively spinning sideways toward the ditch. In an airliner, a UAS could mean the plane is flying too low toward a mountain, approaching a runway too fast to stop, or banking at a dangerous angle. The entire philosophy of threat and error management is designed to maintain a massive buffer between the human error and the undesired aircraft state.
Buffer is key.
Yeah. The crew is constantly scanning the horizon for threats, cross-checking each other to trap errors, and if a UAS occurs, executing immediate recovery procedures to mitigate disaster.
That proactive scanning brings us to one of the most insidious threats in modern aviation. We're flying in an era where the machines are incredibly smart. The flight decks are dominated by massive glass screens and highly sophisticated autopilots.
They're flying computers.
Right. So the cognitive toolkit heavily emphasizes automation management. And this is fascinating because it proves that as technology improves, human psychology often degrades.
The introduction of the glass cockpit solved many problems, but it introduced a dangerous new psychological phenomenon known as automation complacency.
Complacence.
Yes.
Yeah.
When a computer is flawlessly flying the aircraft for 99% of the flight, the human brain naturally disengages. The pilot transitions from being an active physical operator to a passive monitor.
I always compare automation complacency to using a GPS navigation app while driving. Think about the cognitive difference. Before smartphones, if you had to drive to a new city, you had to actively engage with your environment.
Oh, absolutely. Reading maps.
You studied a physical map, you mentally tracked your heading, you looked for specific street signs, and you constantly updated your mental model of where you were. But the moment you turn on a GPS app, you outsource all of that situational awareness to the algorithm.
You really do.
You blindly follow the blue line on the screen. You completely stop paying attention to the road network until suddenly the app loses its cellular signal. The blue line disappears, and you realize you have absolutely no idea where you are, what direction you are facing, or how to get back to the highway.
That is exactly it. And the peril of outsourcing situational awareness is magnified exponentially at 30,000 feet. When pilots suffer from automation complacency, their cognitive engagement drops so low that they lose track of the aircraft's energy state. This leads directly to what the industry calls an automation surprise.
Automation surprise. It sounds completely benign, but in context, it's terrifying.
It is. An automation surprise occurs when the aircraft's computers, acting on complex internal logic or previous inputs, behave in a way that the crew does not anticipate.
Okay.
The pilot looks at the instruments and realizes, with a shock, that the aircraft is descending when they believed they had commanded it to climb, or the throttles are reducing power when they need to accelerate.
The GPS suddenly tells you to turn left off a bridge.
Exactly. The CRM mitigation for this is relentless active monitoring. Pilots are trained to continuously ask themselves three questions. What is the automation doing now? What is it going to do next? And who is actually flying the airplane, me or the computer? They are taught to explicitly verbalize changes in the automation modes, pointing at the display screens to ensure both pilots share the same understanding of the computer's intentions.
But what happens when the computer fails entirely? Or when a massive physical failure shatters the routine? The sources place a huge emphasis on training for resilience, surprise, and the startle effect. Let's dig into the biology of this, because it explains why highly trained professionals sometimes make inexplicable decisions in a crisis.
The startle effect is a deeply ingrained physiological reflex. When a crew is cruising comfortably for hours, and suddenly there is a massive explosion from an engine failure, accompanied by violent vibrations and a cacophony of master warning alarms, the human body reacts before the conscious brain can process the event.
Pure biology.
Yeah. The amygdala, the fear center of the brain, triggers an immediate dump of adrenaline and cortisol into the bloodstream.
It's the classic fight or flight response, but you can't fight a broken turbine and you can't run away from a cockpit. So what happens to the pilot's brain?
The cognitive bandwidth violently narrows. The brain prioritizes basic survival over complex reasoning. Pilots experience profound physiological changes. Their vision tunnels, focusing only on the most prominent instrument while ignoring peripheral data.
Wow.
They experience auditory exclusion, literally becoming deaf to certain alarms, or even the voice of the pilot sitting next to them. This biological hijack leads to two incredibly dangerous behavioral states.
Which are?
The first is inappropriate hesitation, where the pilot's brain simply refuses to process the impossible reality, leading to agonizingly slow reaction times. The second is frozen behavior, where the pilot completely locks up, their hands frozen on the controls, incapable of taking any action at all.
You are biologically paralyzed by the sheer volume of chaotic information. How does CRM training possibly combat millions of years of evolutionary biology?
By repeatedly exposing the pilots to unprecedented anomalies in a safe environment, instructors use full-motion simulators to intentionally trigger the startle effect.
Just scaring them on purpose.
Essentially, yes. They will introduce cascading catastrophic failures without any warning. And the objective isn't merely to see if the pilot can troubleshoot the mechanical issue. The primary goal is to train the pilot to recognize the physiological onset of startle in their own body.
Okay, so self-awareness.
Right. They are taught to take a deliberate, deep breath, sit back, and force their brain out of the amygdala hijack before touching a single switch. They practice acknowledging the panic and then deliberately relying on structured communication and problem-solving frameworks.
They are building cognitive muscle memory to override the panic. And speaking of structured frameworks, let's look at the cultural hurdles these crews face. We briefly touched on the toxic machismo of the 1970s, but aviation is a global industry. You frequently have multinational crews sharing a flight deck.
Very frequently.
The notes bring up cultural differences, specifically referencing power distance and uncertainty avoidance. This feels like the hidden dark matter of cockpit psychology.
It is a massive variable. The CRM community relies heavily on the cultural dimension theories developed by researchers like Geert Hofstede. Let's examine power distance, which measures how a specific culture views hierarchy and authority.
Right?
In cultures with low power distance, authority figures are viewed more as equals. Challenging a boss's idea is encouraged and seen as collaborative. However, in cultures with high power distance, authority figures are treated with immense reverence. The hierarchy is steep and rigid.
So no challenging the boss.
In these cultures, openly challenging a superior is not just uncomfortable, it is culturally taboo. It is perceived as deeply disrespectful and a loss of face for both individuals.
So imagine a cockpit with a steep authority gradient. The captain is at the top of a mountain and the junior first officer is at the bottom. The first officer realizes the captain is making a fatal error, but yelling up that mountain violates everything their culture has taught them since birth.
Now compound that with uncertainty avoidance, which is how comfortable a culture is with ambiguity. If a culture has high uncertainty avoidance, they rely heavily on strict rules and absolute truths to manage anxiety.
Right.
If a junior pilot from a culture with high power distance and high uncertainty avoidance sees the captain doing something dangerous, their internal cultural programming creates an enormous cognitive barrier. They will rationalize the danger by thinking, I must be misunderstanding this situation because the captain is infallible and the captain must know a secret rule that resolves this uncertainty.
They will literally doubt their own eyes before they doubt the captain's authority. This is terrifying. You are asking airlines to train people to override their core cultural identity for the duration of a flight. How do you force a human being to speak up when every fiber of their being is telling them to stay quiet?
You provide them with highly structured, non-ambiguous protocols. When the startle effect hits or when cultural deference threatens to silence a crew member, they fall back on rigid frameworks. For complex problem-solving, the industry uses models like DECIDE.
Let's break down the DECIDE acronym, because this is a tool anyone can use when facing a crisis. DECIDE.
It provides a logical pathway for a panicked brain. Detect. First, clearly verbalize that a change has occurred. Estimate. Estimate the severity and the need to react to this change.
Okay.
Choose. Choose a desirable outcome for the safety of the flight. Identify. Identify the specific actions required to achieve that outcome. Do. Execute the actions. Evaluate. Continuously evaluate if the actions are achieving the desired result.
Running the algorithm.
Exactly. By forcing the crew to speak these steps out loud, it slows the mind down, prevents impulsive reactions, and ensures both pilots are operating on the same mental model.
It's an algorithm for rational thought. But what if the algorithm fails because of human stubbornness? What if the junior pilot runs the DECIDE model, detects a lethal threat, communicates it to the senior captain, and the captain simply dismisses them?
That's the ultimate test.
This leads us to a concept in the research that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. It is called the two-challenge rule.
The two-challenge rule is the ultimate fail-safe circuit breaker in crew resource management. It is designed to shatter the authority gradient when all else fails.
How does it work?
The rule legally mandates that if a pilot observes a safety-critical deviation, they must explicitly state their concern. If the pilot flying the aircraft, even if it is the senior captain, does not acknowledge the concern or ignores it, the monitoring pilot is procedurally required to issue a second challenge.
A second challenge.
Yes, this second challenge must be delivered with heightened intensity, absolute clarity, and often demands a specific change in flight path.
And if the captain ignores the second challenge?
If the second challenge goes unheeded, the monitoring pilot must assume the captain is either incapacitated or fundamentally compromised. At that exact moment, the monitoring pilot is legally required to take physical control of the aircraft, announcing loudly, "Captain, I have the flight controls," and fly the plane away from danger.
I really want to pause and ask the listener to envision this in their own professional life. Imagine you are a mid-level employee sitting next to the CEO of your company, someone with 30 years more experience than you, someone who dictates your career trajectory.
Yeah, picture that.
You are in a car, and the CEO is driving toward a cliff. You tell them to stop, they ignore you. The two-challenge rule means you have to yell at them to stop, and when they ignore you again, you have to lean over, physically pry their hands off the steering wheel, and slam your foot on the brake.
It's a huge deal.
The sheer amount of psychological fortitude, courage, and professional risk required to execute that rule in the real world is almost incomprehensible. I have to push back here. If I did that to my CEO, I would be fired before the car even stopped. How do airlines ensure a junior pilot isn't punished for mutiny?
That is the critical underpinning of the entire system. A CRM framework cannot exist without a just culture. Airlines and pilot unions have established robust, non-punitive reporting systems.
Yeah.
If a first officer executes the two-challenge rule and takes control of the aircraft to ensure safety, their actions will be heavily investigated, but they are protected from retaliation if their concern was genuine.
Okay, that's crucial.
More importantly, this rule is relentlessly drilled in simulator sessions. Instructors will intentionally role-play as stubborn, fixated, or subtly incapacitated captains. The first officer's entire grade for that simulator session will depend entirely on their willingness to assertively execute the two-challenge rule and seize control of the jet.
They practice the mutiny so it doesn't feel like a mutiny when it matters. It becomes a standard operating procedure. But, theory, frameworks, and acronyms are neat and tidy. Aviation regulations, however, are written in blood.
They are.
Let's step into the crucible. How do these CRM concepts actually play out at 30,000 feet when the alarms are screaming? Our sources provide 3 massive case studies that perfectly bridge the gap between theory and reality. Let's go back to 1978, the dawn of the CRM era, United Airlines Flight 173. This is the scenario I hinted at in the intro. Put us in that cockpit.
Right, United 173 is the tragic textbook example of the failure of assertiveness and the lethal consequences of a rigid authority gradient. It was a Douglas DC-8 approaching Portland, Oregon, with 189 people on board.
Okay.
As the crew lowered the landing gear, they heard a loud, abnormal thump, and the aircraft shuddered. When they looked at the instrument panel, the green indicator light that confirms the main landing gear is locked down failed to illuminate.
So they have a legitimate threat, a potential mechanical failure of the landing gear.
Yes. The captain correctly decided to enter a holding pattern south of the airport to troubleshoot the problem before attempting a landing. Now, managing a landing gear anomaly is important, but remaining airborne requires fuel.
Always a factor.
The captain became intensely fixated on understanding the gear problem. He was communicating with company maintenance on the radio, consulting manuals, and entirely consumed by this single non-fatal issue. This is a classic manifestation of cognitive tunneling. His awareness of the broader environment collapsed down to the size of that single light bulb.
And meanwhile, they're flying in circles, and those 4 massive turbojet engines are burning thousands of pounds of fuel every hour. What was the rest of the crew doing?
Well, the flight deck also had a first officer and a flight engineer. The flight engineer's primary responsibility was monitoring the aircraft's systems, including the fuel gauges. He saw exactly what was happening.
Oh, man.
He watched the needles drop towards zero. He knew with absolute certainty that they were running out of fuel. He voiced his concern to the captain multiple times, providing fuel updates. But remember the era. This was 1978.
Right, pre-CRM.
The CRM concepts we've discussed did not exist. The authority gradient was an insurmountable wall. The flight engineer hinted at the problem, but he lacked the psychological tools and the cultural permission to assertively challenge the captain. The two-challenge rule was not in his vocabulary.
He watched the fuel bleed away, knowing they were going to fall out of the sky, but he was psychologically paralyzed by his deference to the captain's authority.
Tragically, yes. The captain's cognitive tunnel was so deep he lost all track of time. The aircraft exhausted its fuel supply. The engines flinged out one by one, and the massive DC-8 crashed into a wooded suburban neighborhood in Portland.
That's awful.
10 people lost their lives. The agonizing irony of the investigation was that the landing gear was actually fully extended and locked into place the entire time. The loud thump was a corroded mechanism, and the lack of a green light was simply a burned-out indicator bulb.
Wow.
The crash of United 173 became the massive catalyst that proved to the world that perfectly good airplanes could be destroyed by a lack of teamwork, forcing the birth of the CRM programs we use today.
It is devastating to think about the agonizing tension in that cockpit, the unspoken terror of the junior crew members. Now, let's contrast that nightmare with absolute triumph. Let's jump forward 11 years to 1989. United Airlines Flight 232 in Sioux City, Iowa. Aviation historians point to this as the ultimate validation of everything CRM was trying to achieve.
Flight 232 is the gold standard of resilience engineering. It was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 flying at 37,000 feet when the tail-mounted engine suffered a catastrophic, uncontained explosion.
An explosion?
Shrapnel from the exploding turbine fan severed all 3 redundant hydraulic lines in the tail section. In a heavy transport jet, hydraulic fluid is the muscle that moves the flight controls. Without hydraulic pressure, you cannot move the ailerons to roll, the elevators to pitch the nose up or down, or the rudder to steer.
So no steering wheel.
The crew lost all conventional control of the aircraft. By every metric of aeronautical engineering, the aircraft was completely unflyable.
This is the ultimate unprecedented anomaly. The startle effect must have been off the charts. The alarms are blaring, the plane is shaking, and the steering wheel is completely useless.
If this had occurred in the pre-CRM era of 1978, the outcome would almost certainly have been a rapid loss of control and a total hull loss with no survivors. But Captain Al Haynes and his crew had been thoroughly trained in the new generations of crew resource management.
Okay, so the training kicks in.
Instead of succumbing to the startle effect, freezing, or letting his ego isolate him, Captain Haynes immediately utilized every single resource available on the aircraft and on the ground.
He flattened the hierarchy the moment the engine exploded.
He did. By an incredible stroke of luck, a highly experienced off-duty DC-10 check captain named Dennis Fitch was traveling as a passenger. Fitch realized something was catastrophically wrong and offered his assistance to the flight deck.
Right.
In a high-power distance culture, a captain might have arrogantly ordered the passenger back to his seat. Captain Haynes, applying perfect CRM, welcomed Fitch into the cockpit. They quickly deduced that their only method of manipulating the aircraft's trajectory was by manually adjusting the thrust levers of the 2 remaining wing-mounted engines.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
By throttling the left engine up and the right engine down, they could induce a sluggish turn. By increasing thrust on both, the nose would pitch up. Decreasing thrust pitched the nose down.
It's like trying to steer a heavy runaway shopping cart with a broken front wheel by only pushing and pulling on the sides of the handle. But they were doing it at 300 miles per hour while descending toward an airport they had never planned to land at.
And the CRM displayed on that flight deck was immaculate. If you listen to the cockpit voice recorder, there is no screaming, no panic, no ego. It is a continuous closed-loop cycle of communication.
Just professionals working the problem.
They're constantly sharing their mental models, proposing solutions, executing them, and evaluating the results, the decide model, running continuously in real time. Captain Haynes delegated the manual thrust control to Dennis Fitch, while he and the first officer wrestled with the useless yokes to provide whatever minimal input they could.
Wow.
They operated as a perfectly synchronized, multi-brained cognitive unit. They managed to navigate the unflyable aircraft to the Sioux City airport and execute a crash landing. While the impact was severe and tragically 112 people died, the miraculous teamwork of that crew saved 184 lives.
It gives you chills. It proves that human resilience, when properly structured, can overcome mathematical and mechanical impossibilities. But, human error is a persistent ghost. Let's look at a modern tragedy that demonstrates how, as our machines get smarter, our human errors simply change shape. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 in 2013.
This case study perfectly illustrates the lethal combination of automation complacency and cultural authority gradients. Flight 214 was a highly advanced Boeing 777 flying into San Francisco International Airport.
Okay.
It was a clear, sunny day, No mechanical failures, no severe weather, a completely routine visual approach to a massive runway.
So the threats were virtually non-existent compared to Sioux City. What went wrong?
It was a cascade of automation confusion. The pilot flying the aircraft was highly experienced overall, but was transitioning to the Boeing 777. He was being overseen by an instructor captain sitting in the right seat. During the descent, the pilot flying made a specific sequence of inputs to the autopilot system that inadvertently changed the auto throttle system into a mode called hold.
Hold, what does that do?
In this specific mode, the auto throttles essentially go to sleep. They remain at their current thrust setting and will not automatically wake up and increase engine power to maintain the aircraft's speed as it descends.
It is the ultimate automation surprise. The human pilots firmly believed the computer was watching their speed, but the computer was waiting for the humans to command the speed.
Exactly. The crew succumbed to severe automation complacency. Because modern jets are so reliable at managing their own energy, the pilots stopped actively monitoring their airspeed indicators. As the aircraft got closer and closer to the San Francisco runway, it got slower and slower, dropping dangerously below the required approach speed.
But there were more than two people in that cockpit, right? Where was the safety net? Where was the cross-check?
This is where the cultural CRM breakdown occurred. There was a relief first officer sitting on the jump seat behind the two pilots. This relief pilot was monitoring the instruments and actually noticed that the airspeed was decaying into a dangerous zone.
So he saw it.
However, we must view this through the lens of power distance. The Asiana cockpit had a steep, culturally ingrained authority gradient. The junior pilot on the jump seat was observing two highly senior captains in front of him, making a critical error.
He saw the threat, he recognized the error, but his cultural programming prevented him from executing the two-challenge rule.
He hesitated. He made mild, indirect inquiries, but he did not assertively challenge the captains or declare that the aircraft was in an undesired aircraft state until it was far too late. The explicit call to go around and abort the landing came mere seconds before impact.
Too late.
The aircraft, flying too slow to maintain lift, struck the seawall short of the runway. 3 passengers died, and dozens were severely injured. It was a tragic, modern reminder that no matter how advanced the glass cockpit is, if you fail to manage the automation and if you fail to actively flatten the cultural authority gradient, the system will catastrophically break down.
It is a sobering reminder that you can never stop training these concepts. You can't just teach assertiveness once and assume it sticks. You have to constantly evaluate it. Which brings us to a really fascinating practical problem regarding how airlines manage this.
Yeah, the evaluation side.
Right. If a pilot is in the simulator and the instructor gives them a simulated engine fire and the pilot forgets to pull the fire extinguisher handle well, the simulated engine burns up. That is an obvious, binary, objective failure. But how on earth do you objectively grade a soft skill? How do you give a pilot a letter grade on assertiveness or resilience without it just being the instructor's personal opinion?
That subjectivity is one of the hardest challenges in aviation training. You are attempting to quantify the invisible. To solve this, the industry relies on standardized assessment frameworks, the most prominent being NO-TEC, which stands for non-technical skills.
Non-technical skill.
The instructors and evaluators do not rely on gut feelings or vague impressions. They are rigorously trained to observe and grade very specific behavioral markers across 4 primary categories: cooperation, leadership and managerial skills, situational awareness, and decision-making.
Give me an example of a behavioral marker. What does good cooperation actually look like on a grading sheet?
Under the cooperation category, an evaluator is not assessing if the pilot is friendly or polite. They're looking for concrete, observable actions. Does the pilot actively listen and acknowledge communications clearly?
Okay, that's measurable.
Right. Do they explicitly ask for input from the other pilot when faced with an ambiguous situation? Under decision-making, the evaluator isn't just looking at whether the final decision was correct. They are grading the process. Did the pilot consider multiple options? Did they run the decide model? Or did they instantly jump to a conclusion and exhibit confirmation bias, ignoring evidence that contradicted their initial thought?
Okay, let me ask the blunt, uncomfortable question. Can a pilot actually get fired just for having bad vibes in the cockpit? Let's say a captain flies the plane flawlessly, grease every landing, but they are just deeply unpleasant to work with, completely arrogant, and score terribly on the no-text cooperation scale. Do they lose their multi-million-dollar career over their personality?
It is a critical question, and the application of no-text is carefully calibrated. Generally, the assessment is designed to be non-punitive. The primary objective is to identify trends and retraining needs.
So training first.
Yes, if a pilot possesses excellent technical flying skills but exhibits poor leadership or CRM, the airline's first response is targeted retraining, not termination. However, there is a hard, unyielding line. A pilot will not fail a line check simply for being gruff, introverted, or uncommunicative unless that behavior causes an unacceptable reduction in the safety margins of the flight.
So if your bad attitude becomes a safety hazard.
Precisely. If a captain's aggressive or dismissive demeanor is so toxic that it causes a first officer to shut down completely, effectively silencing the safety net and preventing the communication of critical flight data, that is no longer a personality flaw. It is a severe safety violation.
Wow.
At that threshold, yes, a pilot can be pulled from flight duty, placed into intensive remedial training, and ultimately terminated if their behavioral profile cannot be brought up to safe CRM standards.
Toxic behavior is treated with the same severity as a leaking hydraulic line. And the people making these judgments, the instructors, must face an immense burden. They aren't just teaching aerodynamics, they have to act as behavioral psychologists to fairly evaluate these nuances.
The standard for CRM trainers or CRMTs is incredibly rigorous. You cannot become a CRM instructor simply by being a senior, experienced pilot. The regulatory bodies like EASA demand extensive specific qualifications. A prospective CRMT must complete a dedicated, intensive 40-hour core course that has very little to do with flying aircraft. The curriculum focuses heavily on group facilitation techniques, advanced instructional design, and a deep dive into human performance and limitations, or HPL.
They literally have to study human cognitive architecture.
I do. They must master the psychology of debriefing. How do you critique a senior captain's poor decision-making without triggering a defensive, ego-driven reaction? They have to deeply understand cognitive biases, the neurobiology of stress, and fatigue models.
That's a lot.
And furthermore, their competence isn't assumed. They are continuously assessed. They must be evaluated by a senior examiner during their first instructional course, and they must undergo mandatory refresher training every 3 years to ensure their psychological toolkit is sharp and aligned with the latest SMS data.
The sheer amount of infrastructure, regulation, and capital dedicated solely to managing human behavior is staggering. And yet, as we move into our final section, the future horizon of crew resource management, it feels like the entire paradigm is about to be turned upside down. The industry spent the last 40 years solving the problem of the authoritarian human captain. But what happens to crew resource management when half the crew is an algorithm or entirely missing? Our notes point to 3 massive technological disruptions on the horizon. Let's start with human-AI teaming.
Artificial intelligence is rapidly transitioning from a background monitoring role to an active foreground role in the flight deck. We are approaching an era where AI will not just passively hold an altitude or speed, it will actively analyze highly complex, deteriorating situations, calculate probabilities, and explicitly suggest courses of action to the human crew.
So it's basically a co-pilot.
It will function as an active teammate. This technological leap necessitates a transition to what researchers are calling an AI CRM framework.
Because right now, pilots trust the computer to do math. But soon, they will have to trust the computer to make tactical life-or-death decisions. How does a human brain manage a relationship with a black box algorithm?
The central psychological challenge of AI CRM will be trust calibration. Humans are notoriously bad at calibrating trust with advanced machines. If a pilot trusts the AI too much, they will suffer from automation bias. They will blindly accept the machine's tactical recommendation, even if their own biological senses and experience scream that the AI is wrong.
Right.
Conversely, if they trust the AI too little, perhaps because it made a minor error in the past, they will ignore perfectly valid life-saving advice and become hopelessly task-saturated trying to manually manage the crisis. Future CRM training will have to explicitly teach pilots how to actively oversee autonomous functions, how to interrogate the AI's underlying logic, and crucially, how to assertively challenge the AI's outputs. You essentially have to train pilots to apply the two-challenge rule to a piece of software.
That is a wild mental image. A human pilot yelling at a screen, "Siri, I challenge your decision to descend into that thunderstorm, and I am taking manual control of the aircraft." But at least in that scenario, there is still a human sitting in the left seat making the final call. The second disruption our sources mention is highly controversial. Single pilot operations, or SPO. This is the aviation industry's push to remove the co-pilot entirely for commercial transport flights, ostensibly to combat global pilot shortages and reduce operating costs.
SPO.
Wait, let me push back heavily on this. Removing the second pilot completely destroys the entire foundation of CRM. We just spent the last 50 minutes talking about how vital cross-checking is, how the two-challenge rule prevents crashes, how team situational awareness prevents undesired aircraft states.
It's a massive shift.
The entire premise of Generation 5T is that a single human will inevitably make an error, and the second human traps it. If you remove the first officer, you literally delete the safety net.
Your reaction mirrors the intense, unified opposition of the global pilot union community. Single pilot operations represents a massive, highly controversial challenge to the foundational philosophy of modern aviation safety. The industry proponents of SPO argue that the traditional redundancy of the second human brain in the cockpit will be replaced.
By what?
The proposition relies heavily on advanced, highly autonomous AI acting as that second crew member, or alternatively, having a remote human operator stationed on the ground in a control center, monitoring the flight via data link and ready to intervene if the single airborne pilot becomes incapacitated or overwhelmed.
But a remote operator sitting in a server farm in Nevada doesn't have the same sensory input as a pilot sitting in a vibrating, freezing, noisy cockpit. How do you possibly manage task saturation when one human is physically wrestling the aircraft and their co-pilot is trying to help over a satellite link with a 2-second audio delay?
That is the massive unsolved puzzle of future CRM. How do you establish and maintain a shared mental model between a human in the air, an AI on the aircraft, and a human operator thousands of miles away on the ground?
Right.
How does a remote operator detect the subtle physiological signs of fatigue, cognitive tunneling, or startle effect in the airborne pilot? The CRM required for SPO will have to completely reinvent how communication, assertiveness, and situational awareness are maintained across vast geographical distances and digital interfaces. Many human factors experts argue that the loss of the immediate physical cross-check is an insurmountable degradation of safety.
It feels like a regression. It feels like we are returning to a dangerous place, relying on the machine to be perfectly reliable so that the single human operator doesn't have to be. To attempt to mitigate these future challenges, our sources mention the third disruption: virtual and extended reality, VR and XR, in training. How does strapping a pair of goggles to your face help build psychological resilience?
VR and XR offer an incredible, cost-effective leap in what psychologists call the ecological validity of training. Traditional full-flight simulators are technological marvels, but they are essentially multi-million-dollar boxes sitting in a sterile warehouse.
Right.
They perfectly simulate the aerodynamics of flying, but they are terrible at simulating the chaotic, messy environment of the entire aircraft. With XR technology, a pilot can put on a headset and suddenly be virtually standing in the passenger cabin facing a massive, chaotic lithium-ion battery fire.
Oh, wow.
They can see the blinding smoke, hear the passengers screaming in panic, and interact with the flight attendants. They are forced to practice their communication, leadership, and stress management soft skills in a highly immersive, genuinely stress-inducing environment.
And because it's a virtual environment, the logistics are democratized. A captain in a training center in London could put on a headset and run a complex CRM scenario alongside a flight attendant who is wearing a headset in a training center in Tokyo.
Exactly. It allows for high-fidelity multi-crew cooperation training without the massive bottleneck of needing access to a limited number of expensive physical simulators. Crews can practice these highly complex multi-departmental emergency scenarios far more frequently, constantly strengthening that vital cognitive flexibility and resilience under pressure.
Let's bring this all together. We have covered an immense amount of ground, tracing a fascinating arc of behavioral science. We started in the late 1970s, where aviation safety meant trying to convince dictatorial, combat-hardened captains to simply listen to the warnings of their junior officers.
Long way since then.
We explored the philosophical realization that human error is inevitable, leading to the adoption of threat and error management to catch those mistakes before they become tragedies. We looked at how these psychological tools are legally codified into lifelong, data-driven training programs. We saw how this training saved 184 lives in the skies over Sioux City, and how the failure to utilize these tools caused devastating crashes in Portland and San Francisco. And now we are staring down a deeply complex future where pilots will be negotiating authority with artificial intelligence and potentially facing the immense psychological burden of flying entirely alone. Crew resource management truly is the hidden, constantly evolving operating system of global aviation safety.
It is the invisible architecture that protects us every time we fly. But the most valuable takeaway from this deep dive is that you do not need to be at 30,000 feet to utilize this operating system. I strongly encourage you, as you go about your week, to analyze your own life and your own workplace through the lens of CRM. Where are the steep toxic authority gradients in your office? Is there a junior employee who clearly sees a project failing but is too intimidated by the power distance to speak up and warn leadership?
Yeah.
How can you proactively implement the two-challenge rule in your daily routines to ensure critical, dissenting feedback is not just allowed but demanded? Are you practicing threat and error management before a high-stakes presentation or a difficult family conversation? Anticipating the complexities, acknowledging your own biases and vulnerability to error, and building a mental buffer to mitigate the fallout. The exact same behavioral tools that trap errors and save lives in the sky can dramatically improve the resilience and success of your own teams on the ground.
It ultimately comes down to acknowledging and managing the messy, beautiful reality of the human element. And that leaves me with one final lingering question to end our deep dive today. We've seen how CRM evolved over 40 years to manage the psychology of the crew. But as we rapidly approach an era of fully autonomous, pilotless passenger flights, think urban air taxis and fully drone-operated airliners, the flight deck won't just have one pilot, it will have zero. When there is absolutely no human crew left to manage the flight, will the aviation industry have to invent an entirely new kind of CRM designed exclusively for the passengers? Will we need a psychological framework to manage our own trust, our anxiety, and our inevitable panic when we are locked in a flying robot with no human voice to reassure us that everything is going to be okay? Or will the whole concept of human resources in the sky finally become a relic of the past, fully replaced by the cold, binary perfection of the machine? Think about that the next time you board a flight and look toward the cockpit door. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.